It has always been said that when the US sneezes, the rest of the world catches the flu. So, with elections underway stateside, it is obvious that, we're all sitting and watching and waiting, not because it's going to impact us directly, or so we think, but because of the fact that whatever happens in the US today, it is going to impact the rest of the world, none more so than Africa, purely because of the inextricable history between the US and Africa. With an election race that is, as drama-filled as Hollywood, it's neck and neck. The impact on Africa is equally so because there seems to be pros and cons on both sides of whether it becomes a Democratic presidency or a Republican presidency, and I'm speaking specifically now from an impact on Africa. So let's unpack this quickly. So firstly, let's clear any misconceptions that we may have. The US will always do what is best for the US. It will always make sure that it has a self-serving agenda, and based on that, so we're not delusional about that, based on that, let us try and understand what that would mean from either a Harris or a Trump administration, right? So let's look at it. Let's start with Kamala Harris. So a Kamala Harris Democratic Party presidency means that we can definitely look forward to investment in Africa on good governance, women empowerment programs and initiatives, as well as digital inclusion. And where did I get this from? I was on the trail when she attended or when she came to Africa early last year. And this was very much a part of her narrative when she visited Ghana, Tanzania, and Zambia. And this was her kind of her framework in terms of what and how she would approach Africa's investment. She was the highest ranking Biden Biden administration official to ever visit Africa. And that followed on from the first US Africa summit that was held by Biden, the last one being held by Obama in 2014. And obviously the contextualized in the US Sub-Saharan Africa strategy. So I think that we can expect her to focus on expansion of what has already been started under the Biden administration and Biden Africa policy, the flagship project of which is the Lobito Corridor, which is obviously the upgrading of the railway line that links Angola of the same port name, Lobito, and it links that particular port with the mines of the Democratic Republic of Congo. So now the alarm bells are going off. Zambia and possibly beyond. So Harris will highly likely pursue a return on investment and look on this project and look at how she could expand to be able to obviously access, because remember, self-serving, so access more and more of what we can expect in terms of the fact that at the moment, Africa is China's playground. And because of this, let's be honest that the geostrategic aim would be to give the US a bigger stake in critical minerals, which China already, kind of has the monopoly on in Africa. Personally, and this is just my particular view, personally, I think that the US is extremely unimaginative in their approach on the Africa strategy. Looking at the Lobito Corridor, just as one example, it could have been so much more. But because the US treats Africa and sees Africa only as an aid destination, in terms of gaining access, so aid in return for access to our minerals, their imagination doesn't allow them to look at how we can mutually benefit. aid for trade, for example, is something that should be looked at, and their imaginations should run wild because the opportunities from an Africa-US truly mutually beneficial partnership are immense. But even though, let's if they can get out of their own self-serving way first, then maybe we can actually head in that direction. But be that as it may, even though this Biden administration has not done all that it envisioned or all that we think is quite possible, let's give them credit for the fact that they spent a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of money in diplomatic relations, in building, in trying with Africa in various ways. It may have been a bit disjointed, but they tried. So let's give them the benefit of the doubt. Having said that, let us talk about AGOA, because AGOA hangs in the balance. So first of all, what is AGOA? And what is the big hoo-ha about AGOA anyway? So AGOA is the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. You go do some more research on it. I'm not going to go into too much detail. And right now, its fate hangs in the balance because the T's and C's going forward of Africa trade with the US is not exactly certain, shall we call it? So yeah, the fate of it hangs in the balance, and it comes down to what will happen to AGOA depends on who is sitting in the White House. So let's take a step back a little bit from all the white noise about AGOA, and let me just give you one quick example of how this affects how AGOA being cancelled or not or confirmed will affect us going forward. So for example, South Africa exports 80% of the world's platinum, and the US accounts for receiving exported platinum from South Africa of 25%, second only to Japan, who is our largest importer from South Africa. The US needs more platinum than they can produce themselves. This is a fact. So let's look at it in context of Brookings, the think tank people. So Brookings have said that if the US cancels AGOA, a loss of AGOA benefits or loss of membership of AGOA, the benefits to South Africa, the loss of those benefits would lead to a GDP decline of, wait for it, 0.06%. Yes, 0.06% for South Africa. There's a perception, and that's why the hoo-ha, there's a perception that it is much larger, that it is hugely significant. Obviously, it is significant in terms of the fact that it makes up large parts of certain industries. But obviously, when you add it all together and you subtract it from the GDP decline, it's a very small portion. So what does it affect? It affects the motor vehicle manufacturing, as well as wine, which is obviously one of our biggest export products, and fruit from a South African perspective. So if it is cancelled, this is what it would impact. AGOA is more likely to be cancelled under a Trump administration, because aside from the fact that he notoriously called Africa the continent of, excuse my language, and in open quotes, shithole countries, close quotes, we can also expect from him that he is and that he will punish Africa because of our close ties with China. And as I said before, Africa is China's playground. So there are rumors about Project 2025, which is a Trump administration strategy drafted by the very ultra-conservative Heritage Foundation, which decidedly in the strategy eliminates funding to any partner that engages with Chinese entities directly or indirectly. Then there's South Africa's strong stance on Israel and the matter of the ICJ. So basically, all in all these things going about, This does not look good on the surface for a Trump presidency. Then there is PEPFAR, or President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, and public health funding in general all across Africa. When Trump came into power previously, he cut funding for all termination of pregnancy services across the continent from US to Africa, funding that was from the US to Africa, as well as withdrawing some of the funding that the US provided to the UN Population Fund for sexual health, reproductive funding. And that could have devastating effect if he had to do this again, if he came into power, which he probably would do, bearing in mind that Africa's rape and sexual violence is a critical issue for us as a continent. So removing this funding and support because of Republican policy will have devastating and far-reaching effects for Africa, but it's a Republican policy. So are you beginning to see how this impacts Africa? And it's just one example. But let's dig a little bit deeper, because it's not all bad on the one side or the other. If we analyze this in a little bit more of a discerning way, so if we analyze this and we look at it just beyond, where and how do the things move, the geopolitical, the geostrategic maneuvers and how they impact Africa in the end. So if we look at this, a Trump presidency could end military aid. That is to the Ukraine. So that is what the Ukraine would be worried about. But ending aid would also mean that Trump would put pressure on the Ukraine to cede occupied territory to Russia and abandon its intention to join NATO in order to end the war, right? So we know this. But this would in turn lower food and commodity prices, which had peaked because of the war, and hit Africa hard. If you go back, if you remember, Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, he said this is going to be a humanitarian disaster as much at the beginning of the war. He said Africa is going to have, the impact on Africa is going to be huge. And we are seeing that. We saw that. We are seeing that. It gets worse and worse by the day. Our poverty indices go up all the time, purely because of the access to grain, for example, as one example, but food in general, in terms of that particular war between, obviously the war that Russia declared on the Ukraine. But if we remove any bias that we may have in terms of Trump's remarks about, open quotes, shithole countries, close quotes, which is imprinted, I have to say, into our memory banks, his first term Africa policy was arguably better characterized by the creation of the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, or DFC, if you remember. So the DFC greatly increased government's ability to catalyze private sector investment. So he was the businessman. He kind of looked at it as a business investment angle. He looked at it from that perspective through various government financing options. So this turned everything on its head, and Africa was then seen as potentially investment from a private sector perspective, as opposed to government aid and seeing us a different way. So in that viewpoint, I'm definitely not. I am far from being a Trump supporter. However, I am first and foremost, because I'm not American, so I'm first and foremost a champion of African prosperity. And hey, if you want to look at us from an investment perspective, I don't hate it. I'm okay. I'm okay with that. I don't hate it. I don't love it that it's Trump, but I don't hate it. So either way, though, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican sitting in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, I'm not expecting Africa to be high on the agenda for either one of them. Either. We are not, on either one of their priority lists. Or we would have actually come up. We didn't even make it to their campaign announcements, their campaign speeches, their campaign focus. We didn't even make it, which tells us that we are not a priority. Here's the thing though, until we become a priority for them. So let's see how this goes and what happens. But in essence, this is just kind of my 2 cents worth on how the US elections will impact Africa, especially from a future economic development and growth perspective.